everyone, to the Spring 2022 Environmental Resilience Speaker Series, jointly presented by Indiana University's Integrated Program in the Environment, or IPE, and the Environmental Resilience Institute, or ERI. I'm Sarah Mincy, Director of IPE and Managing Director for ERI, and I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Both IPE and ERI are motivated to facilitate conversations with today's leading environmental resilience experts from across the disciplines to address topics from climate change to the socio-environmental challenges that are affecting our health, our communities, and our economy around the world. IPE was founded in 2012 by the provost and the leadership of the O'Neill School, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Public Health to bring together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus. And ERI was founded in 2017 as a part of the IU Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. Its mission is to co-create environmental resilience and climate solutions through integrating research, education, and community. IPE and ERI faculty, staff, and students have worked together to bring you a robust set of speakers this semester. And you'll be able to find information about each of these talks on the ERI and IPE web pages and in regular newsletters and upcoming event notices that our organizations regularly send out. So we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters so you'll get reminders about these upcoming talks as well as other news and events that we publicize. Finally, a couple important notes. Please put your questions for today's speaker into the chat box as you think of them, and I'll monitor those throughout the speaker's talk, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. So at long last, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Andrea Jain. Dr. Jain is a professor of religious studies at Indiana University, Indianapolis, a research affiliate at Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute, editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and author of Selling Yoga from Counterculture to Pop Culture, and Peace, Love, Yoga, the Politics of Global Spirituality. Jain's current work, including the documentary film Predation, calls for humanities scholars to center questions about the current pandemic and planetary crisis, arguing that they are uniquely suited for the following tasks: to remind scientists and health experts that equity must be at the center of their response to pandemic and planetary crisis, to uncover and analyze the needs for repair in the relationships between human societies and environmental bodies and non-human animals, and to diagnose capitalism's death-dealing structures and the causes of ecological death in the hope that activists in turn can build on that scholarship to imagine radically different futures. Dr. Jain, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks for having me here today, and thanks to everybody for joining us. I want to start by talking about an editorial that appeared in the Lancet last fall that was signed by more than 200 health and medical journal editors. And this editorial called for a rapid response to combat climate change, suggesting governments cooperate and invest in the environmental crisis with the same degree of funding and urgency with which they've confronted the pandemic. Quote, "The science is unequivocal. A global increase of 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average and the continued loss of biodiversity risk catastrophic harm to health that will be impossible to reverse," the editors wrote. Quote, "Indeed, no temperature rise is safe," end quote. The editors represented every continent in a wide range of medical and health disciplines, from ophthalmology to pediatric medicine and leading international journals. They raised concerns not only about the direct health consequences of rising temperatures, including heat-related mortality, other extreme weather events, pregnancy complications, and cardiovascular disease, but also the indirect costs, including the effects that oil depletion could have on malnutrition and the possibility that widespread destruction of non-human animal habitats could increase the likelihood of future pandemics. Us here became aware at some point of just how damaged the planet is. Whether or not we've been deeply changed by that knowledge, it is not something that we can unknow. We cannot unswallow the truth. Given the realities of planetary crisis and pandemic and the ways they exacerbate existing health and justice disparities, I'm suggesting that if scholars trained in the humanities are to continue our scholarship instead of forfeiting in the face of environmental apocalypse, we must contribute to a response to planetary crisis. Increasingly, we see an expansion of the health and medical humanities, based on the premise that scholars working in the humanities are uniquely poised to help our colleagues, governments, and other members of our communities come to terms with the relevance of culture and society for understanding health. Likewise, we're also uniquely poised to open up critical conversations about how the climate change and pandemic exacerbate existing tensions between conventional health norms on the one hand and politics and the distribution of power on the other. The purpose of our work, I'm arguing, is primarily threefold, as Sarah summarized already, reminding scientists and health experts about the importance of equity in response to planetary crisis, helping humans repair relationships with the environment and their relationship with non-human animals, and critiquing capitalism and the various ways it brings about violence against human and non-human animal communities and ecological violence. Along these lines, my current work responds to the current food system and the ways that the pandemic, climate change, armed conflict, and capitalism work to compound one another and underscore the necessity to transition to more just and sustainable ways of producing and consuming food. More specifically, my work seeks to critically analyze the capitalist, cultural, and social dynamics that revolve around the production and consumption of animals in our current food system. When we talk about food today, we're largely talking about industrialized animal agriculture and its impact on non-human animals and the environment, but also on water privatization, racial and regional disparities in food and water access, pandemic and the spread of disease, as well as labor rights and immigration issues. Whether we're talking about human or non-human animals, the abuses in our food system are similar. Living beings are treated as laborers, consumers, or commodities. They all serve the goal of profit. As scholars of society and culture, we can better understand the following about the food system. On the one hand, the broadly deprived status of non-human animals across many social and cultural formations, including religious traditions, which thereby uphold the social and economic relations of capitalism embodied in industrialized animal agriculture and its environmental consequences. And on the other hand, activist communities that enact radical forms of solidarity between multi-species communities in the ways that they eat and farm, thereby challenging those same relations and industries. I'm not arguing for a moralistic critique of meat and dairy consumption or a philosophical argument for universal veganism. I'm not arguing that there is some natural order of progression from animal liberation to human liberation, or that animal liberation must precede human liberation, or vice versa. I am arguing rather that there is common critical work being done in the humanities, particularly feminism, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, queer theory, and social theory, that's also being done in critical animal studies. That is, challenging the dominant schema of the male, virile, white, heteronormative, human, carnivorous subject. The critique of capitalism is meant to challenge and weaken this dominant schema and the ways it upholds an industry of mass multi-species, and environmental violence. I'm arguing for using distinctively multi-species terms in order to culture under late capitalism, and in turn, imagine practices, policies, and institutions adequate to the ethical demands of the present. I'm arguing that capitalism's oppressions are overlapping, and that becomes clear when we look at industrial animal agriculture. In ways akin to how, in Chomsky's words, the media manufactures consent to various forms of state violence, so these industries and the many institutions that uphold them manufacture consent to mass violence against human and non-human animal bodies and the environment. Now, I'm a scholar of religion, and for almost 2 decades, I wrote about popular forms of spirituality, especially the yoga industry, as a way to understand what religion looks like at this current moment of global capitalism. So I want to back up now a little and explain how I've come to think about environmental and justice and food justice issues, how I made that leap, in other words, from analyzing yoga commodities to meat, and how my conclusions about the former come into play in my thinking about the latter. So I'm going to spend some time talking about forms of popular spirituality like yoga, and how what their role has been generally in the medical industry. And I'll suggest that one thing we learn about how these forms of spirituality or self-care are used to treat pain and illness is that they can serve to contain our descent against much larger forces that caused pain and illness to begin with. They can serve as gestural subversions against the status quo. And I'll get into more later about what I mean specifically by a gestural subversion. But basically, we're going to be looking at these as ways of treating pain and illness in ways that bypass many of the issues of structural and environmental violence, issues that cause the pain and illness to begin with. Now, huge swaths of consumers in global cities all over the world spend their money on self-care commodities, hence the emergence of large transnational corporations, indeed entire industries producing its commodities. Increasingly, healthcare systems reflect the growth and mainstreaming of these industries and their products and practices. We see increasing attention in medical contexts to what are called self-management programs, which can include practices like yoga and mindfulness in doctors' offices and therapists' offices, hospitals, and in research projects. Self-management is a term used loosely in the pain literature, for example, to refer to a wide range of programs through which the individual is expected to play an active role in the management of their pain and healing. A capitalist commitment to self-governance, by which I mean attempts to hold the individual responsible for healing from their conditions of oppression, pain, or suffering, can be seen at play in self-care and self-management discourses of self-sufficiency, which reify the individual, construed as ideally self-optimizing, self-empowering, and self-sustaining. When we speak of the commodities that proponents and consumers describe as empowering, transformative, or liberating, we're not usually talking about things that challenge or weaken dominant social norms or expectations. In fact, much of the ways these products are prescribed are rooted in concerns about deviancy, especially in the form of low work productivity or in their relationship to food and exercise, which intersects with the judgment that people have failed to adequately engage in self-care or that they are non-compliant with doctor's orders. The prescription for self-care have little or nothing to do with societal transformation. In other words, they rather denote requirements for more productive, efficient, and conforming workers and consumers. So as the demands on people to work and be productive have increased, so we've seen an increase in yoga teachers, natural dietary systems, spiritual athleisure wear, and mindfulness courses, which for the most part claim to enhance productivity and simultaneously conformity to a rigid moral, not to mention bodily standard. So everywhere from yoga studios to doctor's offices, individuals are told they should take responsibility for their physical or mental health problems and claim that the members of such groups are non-compliant when they don't consume the right health and wellness interventions. A wide range of commodities, yoga mats, mindfulness, organic foods, anything with Zen printed across it, are celebrated as good consumer choices, products that lead to better living outcomes. So if you're unhappy, unwell, stressed, in pain, or not the proper weight, that's because you're not making the right consumer choices. You're not buying the right stuff. Where you are is on you. Changing your conditions is your responsibility. Gender is central, not peripheral, to self-care solutions. Structural transformation is generally decentered as the solution to gendered inequities. Rather, resolving those challenges is a burden placed on the shoulders of the disenfranchised, that is, women and other gender and sexual minorities. Programs for self-care, in other words, are an individual's tool for breaking the glass ceiling, not dismantling the ceiling. It should not surprise us then that self-management programs are increasingly encouraged for sufferers of chronic pain, which affects a higher proportion of women than men globally. Studies have shown that women are nonetheless less likely to receive treatments such as medication. And this, even though they generally experience more recurrent pain, more severe pain, and longer lasting pain than men. Studies in the US have also found that chronic disease, psychological distress, Medicaid insurance, and lower education levels are associated with higher incidences of pain. Furthermore, there's a significant gap between the evaluation and treatment of pain in white people and its evaluation and treatment in Black and Hispanic people, who are far more likely to report experiencing severe pain. I would argue that many of the factors responsible for the ongoing stigmatization of those suffering from pain and arguments for self-management interventions are embedded in dominant capitalist ways of thinking and structures, especially a capitalist commitment to self-governance over social welfare. So if you're a working mom and feel exhausted all the time or experience chronic pain, take a yoga class. Study mindfulness. These are the ways to achieve that envied work-life balance, not demanding medical interventions wed to structural changes, such as better parental leave policies, access to healthy foods, and childcare at the workplace. If you are Black and experiencing chronic pain and diabetes, take a yoga class, eat healthier. These are the things you should do for yourself, even if you live in a food desert where cheap animal-based foods abound while there's little access to fruits and vegetables, much less readily available, affordable yoga classes. When patients like these return to their doctors still in pain or ill health, having been prescribed self-management interventions, they risk being labeled non-compliant. Now, what should we make of the discourses common in the literature on self-management programs that suggest they offer so-called patient-centered, self-care, and holistic approaches to pain and illness? The assumption in these programs, the assumption is that these programs are patient-centered insofar as they acknowledge the patient's roles in their own healing processes, and therefore have the potential to provide more efficient and comprehensive pain management. Interestingly, much of the literature on self-management programs note that these are relatively safe, cost-effective, and less likely to be stigmatized compared to other treatment approaches, most notably prescription medications, but also behavioral interventions or invasive procedures. Many studies suggest that Given the comorbidity of chronic pain and inherent complications, such as resistance to treatment, inadequate treatment of pain-related comorbidities, these are associated with treating this complex condition, active self-care programs such as yoga or mindfulness or dietary prescriptions for a healthier diet should be considered. However, as Daniel Carr, the president of the American Academy of Pain Medicine notes, quote, non-drug means of pain control, such as cognitive behavioral therapies, while valuable, are like Lamaze breathing for labor pain, not sufficient or even suited for everyone. And insurers often limit payment for such services, end quote. So my concern is not that patient-centered self-management programs, often drawn from spiritual industries like yoga, are not effective in alleviating some of the symptoms certain patients experience. According to many patients struggling with pain and chronic illness, say that they are effective. They experience yoga and other interventions as deeply effective in helping them treat their pain or illness. So I'm not arguing that they are not effective. Rather, I'm concerned about when they stand in place of addressing social and environmental stressors related to race, ethnicity, gender, sex, disability, and class that contribute to lifetime adversity and disadvantage, and that are important to increasing our understanding of pain and illness. Pain stigma affects people suffering from chronic pain, as do social inequities and inequities in access to care and healthy food. People who are already socially and economically disadvantaged have fewer of the resources and adequate forms of assessment and treatment needed to resist pain and illnesses' debilitating effects. So a lack of attention to social and environmental factors, alongside increased attention to the role of the patient in taking responsibility for their own pain and illness, may increase health inequity. Carr suggests, quote, identifying and addressing social, emotional, family, and environmental factors can impact the success of the clinical encounter of the patient with pain more effectively than time spent fruitlessly seeking a pain generator, end quote. Likewise, addressing these factors could impact the types of interventions we adopt, including structural interventions that might address and prevent some of the illness and pain to begin with. In other words, my concern is that prescriptions for self-management might serve to replace attention to the structural factors related to pain and illness among already disenfranchised populations. In the literature on pain medicine, self-management programs are often described as a necessary alternative to other treatments, as more holistic, as considering the interplay of biological, psychological, and social and cultural factors by empowering the patients themselves to play an active role in the healing process. In the larger self-care industry, we hear a lot about empowerment. So what should we make of these calls on consumers to make choices, consumer choices in particular, that empower them? What should we make of the feminist discourses, the calls for women's empowerment that are nearly ubiquitous in spiritual and self-care discourses? The yoga industry's products, for example, include t-shirts with "revolution" appliqued across the front. Some self-care consumers feel empowered to address environmental problems too. They greenwash the products they buy, from yoga apparel to tableware. Everywhere in the developed world, plastic has taken over our households, accessories, and even our clothes. And there's growing concern over the images broadcast across the mainstream media of plastic waste crowding oceans and beaches. Self-care consumers might respond by opting for the high-end organic yoga wear. For example, the type available at Whole Foods Market, where spiritual consumers might also shop for eco-friendly biodegradable paper plates. The multimillionaire entrepreneur and founder of Whole Foods Market, John Mackey, uses the phrase conscious capitalism, arguing that capitalism's heroic spirit is key to creating, quote, a world in which all people live lives full of prosperity, love, and creativity, a world of compassion and freedom, end quote. So what about these entrepreneurs and corporations profiting off self-care commodities that claim to counter the problems of unbridled capitalism with various forms of conscious capitalism? I've spent a lot of time analyzing these subversive elements of self-care, suggesting that rather than a mode through which consumers and patients ignore, escape, or are numbed to the structural problems in contemporary society of white supremacy, of patriarchy, capitalism, and environmental disregard, many self-care commodities, practices, corporations, and entrepreneurs do actually acknowledge those problems, and they in fact subvert them. But they subvert them through mere gestures. From provocative taglines printed across t-shirts or packaging to various forms of charitable giving, self-care commodities and practices serve as a strategy through which subversion itself is contained. In other words, self-care and self-management programs represents areas of culture in which protest against the reigning socioeconomic order is simultaneously expressed and contained through commodification. I came to this way of thinking by drawing on Mark Fisher's work on capitalist realism, the dominant idea that there's no viable alternative to capitalism. And I suggest that choosing self-care interventions and practices that represent revolutionary, empowering, environmentally friendly, or holistic values can be understood as a form of gestural anti-capitalism or gestural subversion. Fisher describes these anti-capitalist ideas that are widely distributed in popular culture and discusses them primarily in terms of Hollywood movies or television. How often is the villain the evil corporation? The film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume without blame or guilt. In other words, in my view, yoga, mindfulness, and other forms of self-care or self-management with their countercultural or subversive gestures are domesticated to the dominant culture, to a capitalist rationality. Another way to put this is that buying these commodities entails a misrecognition whereby the consumer confronts certain social or environmental problems which are caused or exacerbated by capitalism by consuming. Most significantly, self-care industries individualize what are fundamentally social and environmental issues in society. This obviously suits the capitalist worldview. It follows an ideology that you need to work on yourself rather than look to social resources for solutions to your problems or to demand structural or environmental changes. Their discourses are highly useful in depoliticizing the oppressive and increasingly grim reality of life on this planet. So here we are back to planetary crisis. The main force behind the environmental crisis is capitalism's global exponential growth. Capitalists recognize no limits to its expansion. No amount of profit, wealth, or consumption is enough or too much. As a consequence of capitalism's exponential growth, as I speak, the world suffers from increased global warmth, pandemic, and natural catastrophes. Yet, capitalist industries will stop at nothing to contain our descent. Consider the discomfort, even disgust, most of us feel when we actually consider the violence suffered in contemporary food production. The massive violence against non-human animal bodies that is largely ignored in our culture. The actual violence it takes to kill 80 billion animals every year for food. Consider the discomfort that comes with confronting the concomitant violence to human and environmental bodies, the damage to the bodies of laborers, low-income communities and their health, so issues of food justice and accessibility, and the damage to environmental bodies. Here is a small sample of what we know. The consequences of the meat, dairy, and wildlife industries and the ongoing destruction of habitats are devastating for humanity. The meat and dairy industries are highly dependent on fossil fuels, greatly increasing emissions of the main greenhouse gas CO2, and the animals themselves produce huge quantities of methane, another greenhouse gas. About 1/6 of the human population does not have adequate access to clean drinking water. Yet in the US alone, animal agriculture accounts for nearly half of all freshwater use each year. On a massive scale, land is cleared to grow grain to feed the animals that humans will later eat. The widespread destruction and invasion of non-human animal habitats increases the likelihood of future pandemics. It's likely that the wildlife industry was where the COVID-19 pandemic started. Up to 75% of new or emerging diseases are zoonotic. We know that the current planetary crisis and pandemic disproportionately harm the most vulnerable human communities, including children, older populations, ethnic and racial minorities, poorer communities, women, and those with underlying health problems and disabilities. In the United States, for example, in the United States and Canada, for example, Black people are twice as likely to die from COVID-19. Indigenous people are more than twice as likely to die from it. Factors commonly related to race and ethnicity, including socioeconomic status, lack of access to adequate healthy food, including plant-based foods, and healthcare, and increased exposure to the virus while at work put them at increased risk. Vaccination rates continue to lag in low-income countries, where only 15% of the population has received at least one dose of the vaccine. In higher and upper middle class countries, 79% of the population has received at least one dose. This is why some are calling our current global situation a syndemic, in which COVID health disparities, economic disparities, and systemic racism intersect to cause illness, pain, and death. The consequences of the meat and dairy and wildlife industries and the ongoing destruction of habitats are devastating for humanity. Imagine their implications for non-human animals. Each of them is a living being with their own personality and very much capable of physical and psychological suffering. Humans cage or otherwise contain them, commodify them, condemn them to a life of stress, fear, and pain, profit off of them, and eat them. Given the role of our disregard for the environment and the commodification and consumption of non-human animals in contributing to the current planetary crisis and pandemic, the two greatest public health threats today, any discussion of contemporary health, culture, and society should also address our relationships with environmental and non-human animal bodies. The editors of over 200 scientific journals in medicine who signed on to the editorial I mentioned earlier caused rising temperatures and losses in biodiversity, the world's greatest public health threats. Addressing health, pandemic, and climate change, they argue, go hand in hand, and if health is our focus, then environmental degradation should be of utmost concern. I'm suggesting that scholars trained in the humanities join these health professionals and the environmental scientists they cite in their demand for rapid action to prevent further planetary and healthcare catastrophes. Now, consider the following message: eat your own leg. These words appear alongside an image of a lamb printed across t-shirts donned by generally affluent white vegans. So imagine a t-shirt, eat your own leg, with the adorable image of a lamb. White veganism tends to be about single issue advocacy through the most privileged of lenses. Like the discourses of yoga wear, from peace, love, yoga to good vibes only, These vegan commodities offer up counter discourses or dissent against violent capitalist industries that get contained through commodification. Once again, consumers confront certain problems exacerbated by capitalism by consuming. Scholars of society and culture can help us understand the involvement of various industries and institutions, the ways capitalist ways of thinking destroy the social, the collective, and the environment, and the ways protest gets contained in various ways. As a scholar trained in the humanities, I can analyze the ways that eating animals is rooted in a mix of cultural convictions, racial, gendered, and sexual politics, and a long-standing wariness of environmental science. In other words, consuming animals is not just about the dominion and consumption of non-human animals themselves. It's also a way humans slip racial, ethnic, religious, sexual, and anti-scientific politics into arguments for superiority over other humans, as well as the very planet we all inhabit. I can do the work of analyzing that in society and culture, but I'm not a scholar of the earth or health sciences. I do not know either sets of literature. I'm a humanities scholar with an expertise in religion. I hear about breakthroughs and highlights of those literatures and read quite a lot about the environment, the current planetary crisis, and developments in medicine, especially with regard to the current pandemic. But this hardly constitutes real fluency on my part, much less scholarly expertise. So we need that expertise. We need that expertise of earth and environmental sciences, health sciences, and humanities scholars. However, scholarly fluency in whatever academic area is not the only place, or even the most critical place, where cultural change generally happens. It often comes from grassroots or local activist movements. Scholars of culture and society should ask what activists are doing to refuse the containment of their dissent. We should be asking what insights activists working in overlapping injustices, addressing animal justice, food justice, healthcare justice, racial justice, and environmental justice, give us into what constitutes radical resistance and how that includes a commitment to both human and non-human animal liberation. Activist voices draw attention to new worlds of empathy and critical thinking that can open up important avenues of solidarity across communities, helping us acknowledge the ways our capitalist practices and institutions are complicit in overlapping forms of oppression. They show us new ways to map, visualize, and imagine social, animal, and environmental justice in order to prepare strategically for just transitions and futures not possible under our current social and environmental conditions. So visit a sanctuary farm where farmers save animals from the slaughter they would have endured at large industrial factories. You'll find yourself radically reoriented, or perhaps disoriented, in your relationship to non-human animals. There, each animal is treated as a living being with their own personality and very much capable of physical and psychological suffering. This space is out of sync with the world around it, where humans consume animals for their purposes and pleasures. Or consider the Black vegan movement. In the United States, Black people are almost 3 times more likely to be vegan and vegetarian than other Americans. And 8% of Black Americans are vegan or vegetarian, compared to just 3% of the general population. They tend to make arguments for veganism in terms of Black health and food justice. Eliminating animal products, they argue, reduces the likelihood of developing chronic illnesses like diabetes, cancer, and hypertension that especially plague Black communities. Many Black vegans argue that advocating for Black communities' access to plant-based foods is more important now than ever before, as COVID-19 ravages Black communities, in part because of their higher rate of pre-existing chronic conditions. Numerous studies show that plant-based diets are associated with lower risk of developing these and other chronic conditions. Socioeconomic factors, including poverty and living farther from grocery stores, offering quality plant-based options, but closer to fast food and racial injustice, Black vegans and vegetarians argue, contributes to the poor diet of many Black communities. Embracing vegan diets go hand in hand with addressing food injustice. Black-owned organizations are emerging that deliver vegan and vegetarian meals to predominantly Black inner-city communities, or hold events like Black Veg and Vegan festivals, created by and for the Black community in order to raise awareness about the intersections of racial, health, and food injustices. Many also lobby to improve animal welfare, addressing the overlapping injustices of white supremacy, police brutality, and brutality against non-human animals, and capitalism. The Black vegan movement also has roots in the American rights movement, the American civil rights movement. Dick Gregory, a famed Black civil rights activist who marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr., gave up meat in 1965 and later became a strict vegan. Quote, "Because I am a civil rights activist, I am also an animal rights activist. Animals and humans suffer and die alike. Violence causes the same pain and the same spilling of blood, the same stench of death, the same arrogant, cruel, and vicious taking of life. We shouldn't be a part of it," end quote. Black vegans and sanctuary farmers are intentionally non-compliant. They challenge social constructions, binaries, domination, and normalcy. They demand that we do more than engage in gestural subversions, donning t-shirts with the message, "Eat your own leg," or buying expensive vegan foods at Whole Foods Market. They demand instead that we radically reorient our relationships to food and non-human animals. That we want not only acknowledge animal suffering, but cease killing and eating them, and instead live among them as members of shared communities. That we acknowledge how chronic disease and systemic racism are currently inextricable and make plant-based foods accessible to Black communities and in public schools and hospitals. Their efforts resist white supremacy and capitalism, imagine and enact forms of solidarity between communities dispossessed by capitalism's death-dealing structures, and provide insights into the experience of being marginalized and what resistance, not simply gestural subversion, looks like in the present moment. Environmental concerns are not just environmental. Rather, one way to address other problems in society and to change social structures. Likewise, healthcare is not just about the human body's health or even society, but also about our relationship with the environment and non-human animals. So will we continue with business as usual, under the mistaken notion that capitalism can undergo unlimited expansion on a planet with finite natural resources, even as we face pandemic, climate change, armed conflict, and as capitalism compound these? If we do, there will be even more extreme weather patterns, floods, droughts, and forest fires. There will be more extinctions and losses in biodiversity. There will be more pandemics and armed conflicts. There will be more suffering for humans and other animals. And there will eventually be not just social problems like inequity and healthcare, but the very death of life on this planet. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I hope that we have some questions. We can open it up for conversation or Q&A.
Thank you, Andrea. Excuse me. Thank you. That was fascinating. And we don't have questions in the chat, but I have a number of questions, and so I'll invite everybody to jump in either through chat, or we have a small enough group here that it's fine. I think if folks just want to raise your hand and speak up, that would be welcome as well. So I'll just get us started, Andrea. I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about how humanities scholars can join medical providers, for example, in building solutions And I'm specifically curious about the scales at which you think that's most effectively done or most appropriately done. So I think of the fact that there are, systemic, huge challenges of issues like food deserts and healthcare accessibility. There's these huge challenges of corporate greenwashing, that you're outlining, but then all this comes down to sort of individual healthcare and outreach to individuals. And I wonder where do you think humanities scholars can get a foothold and get traction to make a difference?
Well, I suppose that most importantly, there needs to be platforms for humanities scholars in healthcare environments, and at the conferences of healthcare providers, in hospitals. And medical humanities as a discipline has done a great deal of work toward making a case for students, for example, being trained in medicine to study the humanities and have courses on society and culture, and the ways that illness and pain are related to social, cultural, and environmental factors. So I think that providing platforms for humanities scholars in those conversations with medical experts, whether it be in medical schools or medical conferences, that's the best way to create more responsible conversations about health.
Do you yourself contribute to conference presentations, medical conference presentations?
I haven't been invited to conferences, but I've given a number of talks to medical humanities audiences at medical schools.
Right.
And I did publish a piece in the Journal of Pain Medicine, from which some of this talk was drawn from, critiquing self-management programs. So I've like chiseled a tiny bit at this conversation, trying to lend the voice of the humanities, critics of society and culture, to the medical system, but it's just tiny bit.
Excellent. Christopher Miller, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. It's good to see you, and to see someone in the humanities talking about this. To be honest, it's kind of a relief. I remember Bill McKibben at the annual, the AAR's annual meeting, I think it was like in 2015, said, with climate change coming on so fast, you should all devote some percentage, I can't remember, like 25% of your scholarship towards climate change. And I see this as like, this is what you're doing. And yet, when I go into, like, say, my department or some sort of like humanities group, and I try to talk about these very important issues, and I get a lot of resistance. And so I'm curious about, this resistance within the humanities to talk about the animal and the intersection of the animal with all the things you said, with climate, with race, with gender. How do we sort of bring this conversation forward in a productive way that won't turn people away, and people will show up for these kinds of things?
Yeah, so Chris is a colleague of mine in the study of religion, and so when he talks about the AAR, that's the American Academy of Religion, that's our largest professional organization, and so I appreciate that he's pointing out that even in our own discipline, we get resistance to this argument that as humanities scholars, we are compelled to address the planetary crisis. And I've experienced that myself, Chris. And I suppose the strategy I've adopted is I guess twofold. First of all, just reminding our colleagues of just how dire the current situation is, because it's so easy for us to avoid addressing it in the humanities, where we're not always otherwise confronted with the reality of climate change and the threat it poses. So being a voice of reminder that these crises are real, and they're apocalypse is impending, even speaking their language. And then also pointing out something I mentioned earlier in the talk about the work we're already doing in the humanities, in feminism, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, queer theory, and social theory. That's also at work in critical animal studies. Even though critical animal studies hasn't had as large a role in the study of religion, for example, we don't have as many people doing critical animal studies as, say, post-colonial theory or feminist theory, for sure. But pointing out that there's common work being done that challenges who we consider to be the subject. And in all of these areas of critical scholarship, we're challenging this dominant schema of the subject as male, white, heteronormative, a meat eater, and human. And when I point that out, it helps bring to light our unique position in addressing these problems of capitalism, from environmental degradation to mass violence against non-human animals, and the ways that our violence against non-human animals is bound up in violence against certain human communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And you just made me rethink at the end of your response. The response I got when I brought a similar idea, just that we should be thinking about these things, to my own department, was they felt like the white, heteropatriarchal, heteronormative machine was trying to control their bodies. And I said, that's actually precisely the opposite of what the intent here is. It's to show that through the animals, the way that animals and the, it's connected to those things, it is the white heteropatriarchy working on your body. So I think it's like flipping that script, right, to kind of show that it's actually that kind of thinking's been deconstructed in all the fields that you've brought up here. So anyways, thank you.
Right, yeah, and there's a lot of work in critical race theory addressing animality. And there's, of course, the Black vegan movement, bringing those movements to light among our colleagues are important, I think, and providing platforms for those activists in academic spaces are important, I think.
Another listener asked the question, can you talk a little bit more about your environmental humanities work? Specifically, your talk reminded this person of the work of ecofeminists like Val Plumwood, who wrote a great essay called Being Prey that might be of interest, and Greta Gard. Along the same lines, interested in hearing more about multi-species justice as a term.
Yeah, so multi-species justice is a fairly new term that is just becoming, I mean, I wouldn't say it's even become very common in academic work on animal rights and human rights. But increasingly, we're finding a lot of feminist scholars in particular following along work done by Carol Adams. Carol Adams wrote the book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, which addressed the ways in which violence against women is overlapping with violence against non-human animals. And so the ways we justify violence against women is by animalizing them, making them less subjects by making them like animals. And likewise, the way we justify violence against non-human animals is through feminizing them. And so this feminist scholarship is by Carol Adams has kind of laid a certain foundation for other work that's looking at similar ways in which violence against non-human animals lends itself to violence against certain human communities, including Black communities in particular. And you have a lot of work in critical race theory now, addressing animality as this critical way of understanding historical violence against Black people. So that just gives you like a little snippet of the background. I can't really do a whole lit review, but I would say in those two areas in particular, feminism and critical race theory is where we've seen the emergence of the most concern and talk about multi-species justice.
Thank you. Another listener asked, have you thought about the implications of animal testing used in the development of the COVID vaccine? the fact that non-human animals are genetically engineered into states of suffering to test vaccines that benefit only humans for a virus that was likely caused or at least exacerbated by the direct harm of non-humans.
Yes. So one of the things so let me just first say that among those of us working on non-human animals in the humanities, there is a split between a more kind of welfarist approach that is concerned about animal welfare and making animal situations as best as we can, step by step. And so the welfarists are more likely to say, rather than just abolish industrialized animal agriculture or experimentation on animals for medical purposes, let's think critically about how animals' conditions can be improved. And then there are the abolitionists who say, no, we need to abolish these systems altogether, abolish animal experimentation altogether, abolish the consumption of animal products altogether. And finding one's place in, on either side or in between can be tricky. In my case, I have chosen not to frame my work in terms of a sort of call for moral purity. I'm not prescribing universal veganism. I'm not suggesting that animal liberation must precede human liberation or care for humans, or vice versa. Instead, my work is an anti-capitalist critique. It's critiquing large industries that profit off of massive violence against both human and non-human communities. I also think there's nuance to be found in how we talk about where the burden should be placed in terms of addressing the violence of these industries. Should the burden be placed on indigenous populations who historically have had their own unique relationships with non-human animals, which involve killing and eating them? Or should the burden be placed on wealthy nations that are producing the greatest amount of greenhouse gases and are consuming meat at rates far higher than any rate ever seen before in human history? And I would say we should be putting the burden on the latter. We should be thinking about capitalist industries and the massive violence they produce, rather than targeting indigenous communities or prescribing universal veganism or suggesting there should never be a space in which animal harm occurs in our society. I don't address specifically medical experimentation, but I'm certainly not targeting certain limited experimentation on animals involved in the production of certain vaccines, like the COVID-19 vaccine. And I think there is some nuance there, but it's tricky. It's tricky for sure.
Andrea, I think any other question from any of the audience members or my own would take too long. You couldn't do it justice here in probably the minute that we should have left. So I think I'm going to close us here with that the last question. But please let me thank you so much for your time today and your energy. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. Andrea, any last comments?
Oh yeah, I'll just say thank you for being here, and thanks for those excellent questions. I really appreciated them. And this is very much a work in progress. So all the more reason why I'm so grateful for this opportunity to talk about my work and to hear questions. So thanks again for engaging me.
Thank you. Thank you again for your time, and thank you for challenging us with some really interesting topics. Everyone, thank you for joining us, and we will continue these conversations in the future. Check our website for our next talk. Thank you all. Have a great day.